Sure, we had what felt like a real luxury of a day together in Philadelphia recently. And we did a little bit of talking about sort of our stories. And so I wanted to ask you a little bit about your story and what brought you to this work and like this body of ideas.
Yeah, I guess I'll start from the beginning. I grew up in the Boston area in a suburb outside of Boston. And it's pretty isolating as a young black girl in that community. But we were there, like many other people, for the schools. It's one of the strongest school districts, I guess, in this country, one might say. But also, that was mediated, the isolation, by my seven brothers and sisters. And also my parents, both their professional communities and their social communities that often landed us in Boston or Cambridge. My folks bought their house in 1969 in Newton, met with a lot of hostility. We were ignored or kind of harassed, I would say. I think our neighbors of 30 plus years didn't acknowledge us unless they were having a fight with my dad. So that was real. And so I think at a very early age, I understood the ways in which race and racism kind of shape people's lives, daily experiences, and also too often, their material realities. But so Newton was an interesting place in terms of it's very progressive, well resourced. Schools were pretty engaging. But, there was a lot that wasn't in the curriculum that kind of captured human history and people's contributions. My mom was an educator. My dad also a community organizer, social worker. But she made certain that our kind of homes, our lives were just littered with history and the experiences of Black people. We actually had a Black History Month contest in our family. All eight of us would research someone and we would present. I learned the poems of Gwendolyn Brooks at a very young child, but also their friends who were also professors at like Cambridge and Boston universities were the juries. And so we had exhibition as a very young person around Black history. But they were our aunties and uncles, actually, play aunties and uncles. But those experiences really helped me think about identity, racial equity, and schooling and how to engage young people in schools in ways that really allow them to be their best selves.
Thank you, Cheryl.
Yeah.
We talked a little bit about just the fact that we've been hanging around for a while, which is a nice way of saying we're a little bit old. And there have been a couple other eras of like calls for school redesign. My organization is a product of one of those. So why Center for School Redesign now?
Yeah, the Center for School and System Redesign is really moving into a space that will facilitate like kind of coherence building, right? There's a lot of challenge in redesigning secondary schools in particular. Learning Policy Institute comes out of California, and they've engaged in a lot of research and kind of policy making for California. And there's been a historic investments around community schools, and extended learning, a lot of opportunities, resources that could facilitate the work that needs to happen because we know it's high touch, high cost. And so we want to figure out what is in the way of some of those systemic changes taking shape. And we think we're interested in building capacity in organizations and transformation providers, but also really thinking together with folks in the field about what are the constant barriers, what are the areas of tension, what are the new policies that need to be set that really allows the work to take root and to grow and to expand. And that's our hope.
You mentioned tension, areas of tension. We're having a moment. And when you and I initially connected around this talk 6-7 months ago, we thought we might be in a different place by the time we were sitting on this stage. So I wanted just to invite you to reflect a little on the moment, kind of our assumptions, 7-8 months ago about where we thought we might be, and where we find ourselves in this moment as it relates to the work.
Yeah. I mean, I think there is, regardless of where we are now, I think there really is a lot of energy, a lot of appetite, a lot of agreement about the need for change in schools, right? 80% or so of students and families feel disengaged. I think at that moment we were also imagining more possibilities. We're thinking about what the federal legislation might be an opportunity in this moment to expand the work and to deepen the work. And we don't know. We're looking, at state opportunities, right? How do we really work with states to continue the work that they're doing, to think about assessment practices or policies that can support the good work that has been happening and to expand that work. So it's a challenging moment in a lot of ways. I think there's public education and other public entities are really they're really in a challenging spot, right? And I think that we have to address that. And I actually think that there is this disruption. There's a moment of opportunity in the disruption. I thought about this and the fact that our young people, right, high school students, young adults who are starting college, not only are experiencing this moment, but they experience the COVID-19 pandemic. And a lot of people want to talk about lost learning and these sorts of things, but I think about just like the developmental losses and the opportunities to become young adolescents, to understand and develop the skills to transition into adulthood, to think about their ways of engaging in a democratic process. So I also felt like that was a lost opportunity. When COVID happened, I was like so eager to kind of get in the field and talk to teachers and families and leaders. And I started that process, but COVID happened. So we all stepped back in a lot of ways. But I felt like that was a lost opportunity because we know schools aren't working in so many ways for so many young people and their families. And we kind of just got back to the same thing. And so I think about this moment of disruption as an opportunity to really do something different and think about we know what the conditions need to be, we know what makes successful schools and how to sustain them, but how do we really lean into this moment of disruption to innovate and to really work with communities and leaders to design in the ways we know are required. Yeah.
You mentioned we know a lot, right? With this, and we mentioned there have been other sort of cycles of call for new designs. So is innovation, as you think about this moment, is that more about summoning new models, or is it about acting on what we know?
I think it has to be a little bit of both. But when I think about what we know, and the research is really clear, and so both of our networks, both of our work kind of names the features that are needed in order to have positive school experience and good outcomes, right? So we know it's about developing deep relationships and creating structures that support communication and for young people to be known well and to have advisory systems and all of these things that make students feel seen, supported, and kind of mentored into what they need to develop into young adults. So I think there are many models that have been around for 10, 20, even 30 years that have those features and but have to continually fight and renegotiate, right, to keep their structures and practices going. And that's a lot of work. And so our visit to a few schools in Philly, that's what we were reminded, the amount of energy and time it takes for leaders to do the work that they know will allow their young people to be successful is constantly a renegotiation process. And so one of the things the center aims to do is really to get policies out of the way at the district level, at the state level, that undermine the work that is required. And at the same time, yeah, the world is changing rapidly. Knowledge is changing dramatically. I think that we do want to think of brand new models, right? I think we want to blur the kind of walls of classrooms and schools even more. We want to have communities in schools and young people out in communities. And so I think that there are certainly models that we haven't envisioned yet. And I think as, the way we engage learners, the way knowledge looks, like we probably need to innovate to really capture and to leverage all of those changes. Yeah.
You mentioned it just now. We had a really fun day last week in Philadelphia
Was that
together.
just last
I
week?
know.
Nice.
Feels like a long time ago at this point. I just wanted to invite you to sort of reflect more on what you were thinking about as we left the day. We had a chance to visit two schools, the workshop school and Building 21, and you already did a little bit of that. But what else did you leave that day thinking about and reflecting on in this work?
Well, I think that part, particularly at the workshop school, trying to remember what year they're in, but one of the leaders was just talking about how new the community of teachers is, right? And so that was a reminder of even when we get the right model and we have made strides and we are seeing strong student outcomes, you have to continually have conversations about why that mission, why these practices, why that policy, in order that the exhibition doesn't become superficial, right? And so it is a lot as well. Like, even if there weren't kind of tensions and barriers around policies, it just requires a lot to continually build the culture, refine the practices, and do strong work. I think one of the other takeaways from that experience at the workshop school in particular was the young people. They were ambassadors, and we got to listen in on that conversation. And so the sense of agency, what they appreciate about but purpose, but more often they talked about choice in their schooling experience. And again, I think we were listening into a conversation about student ambassadors around their community circles or advisories. And they weren't working particularly well, right? And they were open about that. And they brought the young people into that conversation. And they were saying, what's the why? And, those are really important practices for community building, for making young people feel safe, and allowing them to be themselves. And we only got to hear a tiny part of that conversation where they were brainstorming how they might change the questions of the circle and how they might change the time in order to have people present and know it's an important piece of the day. So that was just a reminder again of like the real hard work and making it deep and sustained and have the kind of impact that we want and why we've designed certain practices and structures. So that was one of my reflections. Yeah.
Again, we saw these two great schools, these leaders working incredibly hard, both to keep advancing a vision, but also to hang on to it over time. And as you mentioned, I'm sort of connecting back to your commentary a moment ago on we know a lot. We've seen great models emerge over time. The research is consistently pretty clear about the key ingredients. So what do we have to summon in this moment to move those ideas forward in a way that generates some momentum that's been a little bit elusive lately?
Yeah, I think about that a lot, particularly as we roll out this center. But I do think one of the things is we've talked about scaling these efforts oftentimes, and there are moments that scaling has actually devolved the momentum, right? And it changed the actual spirit of the transformation that we're hoping to accomplish. So whether that is too fast to scale, right, and too ambitious a timeline, or just that the monies are there, but people don't have the capacity to plan, to talk, to engage, and to really deeply have the experience and all the elements ahead of a launch. And so I think that is one thing that we really need to be thoughtful about. But I also believe that we should not maybe even use the word scale, right? Maybe we should reframe it all together and think about, like, particularly in these networks, as we come together here over these several days, like there are strong networks and we get a lot about engaging each other, learning with one another, re-energized, I think, by just kind of being reminded that people are doing great things out there and having positive experience, and that there's more than we always remember. Like there's more good going on than we remember. So a lot of times we want to raise up the bright spots, like a school like Building 21 or the workshop school, but we also need to think about intentionally learning together and being connected in these kinds of networks, but even more broader kind of coalitions, and maybe multi-sector, right? There have to be ways in which we engage community partners and we engage, other public institutions in thinking about school more broadly. And I do think building momentum from those coalitions in order to create the enabling conditions, because we know what the practices and policies need to be. But I also then think we need to do some policy work really to move schools from out of compliance mode into innovation mode. Yeah.
I appreciate your reflections on sort of like the work of coalition building and working across system boundaries. It was one of the things that struck us as we spent time in those schools, is that the leaders of those schools were really acting as system integrators,
That's right.
working across multiple system boundaries, even though that's not in anybody's job description. It was a lot of their time
That's right.
working across different levels of a system, working beyond the boundary of school to make their school viable.
That's right. That's right. And I think you were talking about the fact that I think you were talking about that everybody doesn't have to be a systems thinker, leader. Might have been a different conversation.
I'm very nervous anytime a conversation starts with, do you remember when you said?
Well, I was having a recent conversation and someone was talking about, well, everybody doesn't need to be a system thinker. And I do, I was kind of reflecting on that, and that's probably true. But I think if we're really talking about teacher leaders, and if we're really talking about joint shared leadership, and we're really like, there are ways in which I think most educators need to be systems thinkers. But I do think it's also important to notice, to name that there are different levels of the systems we're always going to be operating at, and that the leaders we were speaking to had experience, right, at the district and then came back to the school site. And I think that that really helps understanding the different contexts that are operating, right, at any given time. But it does really help to think systemically if we're going to really make some long-term sustained change. Yeah.
And I know we're getting close to the time we'll engage with our audience, and I know it's still emerging, but I wanted to invite you just to cast the vision for the center.
Yeah, so we've started just kind of with a listening tour and did a 7-part series, a webinar series, bringing practitioners, kind of highlighting great practices, great schools, great leadership, and thinking with folks about, again, what are the barriers, what are the things that we want to shift as we deepen our work. But the other thing for the center is really to do some of this network building, really, to kind of create space and opportunity for folks to come together, primarily to do some strategic policy setting, agenda setting. And so that's one of the things that we really hope to do. And LPI has a very strong, record of working and creating policies that are responding to educators and research in terms of translating the research. But I think it's really important to be closer to the ground, listening to folks who are in schools and communities, and kind of and having that inform the policies that we create in order to support school system redesign. So that's where.
Hello, everyone. It is now time for you to ask those profound questions or make comments or push back, whatever you want to do. We got 35 minutes. You can get it all in. All right. And then, Austin, can I get another mic to run around? For just sharing, I didn't know they were going to do this. I thought they were going to be, asking each other questions. But Jim was like, no, I want to shine all the light on Dr. Cheryl here.
I thought so too, Michelle.
Yeah, he didn't understand the assignment, but it's all right, sis. We got to learn a lot about what the work that you're doing. All right, what questions do we have? Yes, Alec.
All right, hey there. I've got this is a two-part question. First, I want to know, what's a change or a structure or like a thing that you would just like every school in the country to do? Like, if you just say, like, look, you all could do this. This is doable, and this would make things better. That's my first part. Like, that comes from New Tech Network, that comes from the LPI's work. And then the second one is, what is something that you want the schools you work with to get better at?
It's a challenging question for me, Alec, because so much of our work is about is contextual. And so much, well, certainly, half of our work is, yes, we have these ideas that we believe very powerfully in. But a full other half of our work is figuring out, like, what is the path that change can travel in this specific community, right? Who are the individuals? What are the structures? What are the systems that have to navigate? And that is, while there's certainly themes, like, it is contextually different, literally in every community that we spend time in. So I'm a little hesitant to proclaim, like, everyone do X, because I do think, part of the point of this space, of this community, this conference, right, is not go replicate everything that you see, right? It is, what does it look like to express these ideas in your context? I think at the center of that is taking the humanity of students and adults in the building really seriously. In the deep dive, and a couple people that were in the deep dive yesterday, we talked about sort of the long arc of deeper learning and how these competencies came to exist. And that even though for many of us that are part of this community, there's a richness and a dimensionality to them that pull in lots of other domains, they came out of a definite conversation about economic competitiveness and economic viability. And so I think the thing I would say, like, I want all of us to do is broaden our lens, right? I don't think we can summon new models until we consider other driving rationales for public education than economic competitiveness. And I don't mean abandon it. I have 3 kids. I joked to Cheryl about this when we were in Philadelphia. It is a life goal of mine for them to get jobs and move out, right? So I'm not saying run away from economic, but I think we will continue to see reproduction of the same things over and over again unless we can talk about a broader and richer set of purposes than just economic competitiveness.
See, that's why we want you to talk too, Jen.
That's right.
Right
I guess I didn't ask the question. But I do think that is really important because there are ways in which this kind of interest and kind of thinking about communication and compassion and, right, having collaboration skills for the job market. Like, that's not the full reason we're doing this work, right? It is so that they have, young people, a unique contribution, that they are able to kind of deliberate and think about what ways the system needs to change and these sorts of things. So I think we really both need to kind of reframe the why around some of these durable skills that have become very popular in the conversation. It's bigger than being ready for the job market. I would say in terms of what schools should be doing, I think having a strong advisory system is really critical. I think having teacher collaborative time in the day is really critical. I don't know that we can meet young people's needs well and support them in and out of the classroom without those 2 things. And the adults in the community need to be learners as well and collaborating as well. So I think those are really key. Not sure that we can do it effectively without those 2 structures.
So I'm curious, you're in a lot of schools, especially high schools. Have you seen examples of strong, effective tech policies that support learning instead of sort of restrict it? It feels like a constant battle of middle and high school. Have you seen anybody doing it well? What are they doing?
I'm not overwhelmed by what I've seen, to start bluntly. In part because the vast majority of the work of New Tech Network is in traditional public systems around the country. Typically, decisions about purchasing technology applications are made at a district level. And there's not a corresponding or simultaneous conversation at the school or classroom level about what's the environment we're trying to create and how do we deploy these tools in a coherent way to help bring forth that environment. So, and we don't have to look very far back in our history, right, to have a really profound example of that in the pandemic, right, where many districts just had stuff laying around that was unused, and they were trying to figure out how to use it in real time. And then many places made mass purchases very quickly and again, we're trying to figure out. So I've seen schools do really thoughtful things around discrete challenges like AI or cell phone use, and have students and families at the center of a conversation creating policy. But I think the big challenge, right, that I see as we spend time around the country is that, right, there's a disconnect between the conversation about purchasing tools and about what it looks like by the time they're getting used, and how they work together to create a coherent environment that's in support of this stuff. So it is a challenge, and I think it's something. Tech in our name, I know we've joked about this for many years, right? It's a little bit of a misnomer. Certainly, there was an element of our work early on that had a strong tech component in terms of a learning management system. But our joke was, when we used to have a physical office before we were a fully remote organization, people would literally wander in off the street and ask us, like, "Do you teach like computer classes in here?" And we're like, "Okay, we are a victim of bad marketing." So that is more how we're thinking about the sort of the tech part of our identity right now, which is how do we support districts in thinking coherently about a set of tools, as opposed to sort of the single, like typically we purchase tools, or districts purchase tools to solve individual problems. And they're not thinking across like a broad set of challenges and like a coherent set of tools to take on those challenges. So we have to go after that, I think, to get more compelling tech policies being more common around the country.
Yeah, I guess I think I would just add that idea of technology as a tool, right? I think particularly in classrooms, it's really easy to lose track of it. It's just part of a toolkit that we're utilizing. And so I think about AI. I feel like schools really need to have deep conversations about AI and how they're imagining utilizing it. What are the opportunities? What are the challenges? I think early on, we had this idea that, like, put your laptop down so that you can focus, right? And now schools mostly have one-to-ones, right? And I think there's ways in which those have been utilized to really support individualized learning or meeting students' needs. But I think finding that line is a really critical thing to keep revisiting and keep track of, and making sure that it is supporting the kind of learning environment that we are trying to create, and rather than kind of losing like the relational human aspect of teaching and learning. Because a lot of classrooms I've been in lately, there was far less discussion, far less mini lessons, far less. And so I think we want to really keep good track of that. And then we also saw, like at Building 21, they have been doing competency-based learning for 10 or plus years. They have really great performance tasks in there, and they're utilizing AI to take what they've developed, right, and really have fine-tuned ways of young people to understand where they are in their competencies. And so that's pretty powerful. That's an exciting way of using the tech.
I think this relates a little to the first question, but I've been thinking a lot about I'm looking here because of our doctoral program. At least for my cohort, we started pretty early on talking about what is the purpose of schooling. And I know, again, I think the first question got a little bit at that, but I'm just really curious because I think that is at the heart of a lot of our confusion about what we're even trying to do. And there might be as many different answers in this room to that question as there are people. So I'm just really curious, what your answer to that question would be.
You want to start this
You
time?
go.
Yeah.
They've heard a lot from me.
So I would insert one word into your question, the purpose of public schooling, before I respond. And so my response would be grounded probably in that frame in particular. I talked, again, a little bit about some of this in our deep dive yesterday. Certainly, again, I'm not railing against the reality that, yes, economic viability and mobility is a worthwhile goal for students. I do think we need a fuller centering of just like human thriving, right? And like what are the dimensions of like human thriving and joy and happiness and connectivity and relationality? And so that is certainly at the center of school for me. And when I spend time in amazing schools, that is so palpable, right? That sense of like human connection and just joy and vibrancy. Like you feel it when you walk in the door. Nobody has to explain it to you as part of the mission. The other piece that is heavy on my mind right now, and again, I think is really bound up with the word public in public schooling, is the degree to which we center democracy and the preservation of democracy. I think that's really challenging right now because a deep belief in the practice of democracy, right, forces you to want to spend time with people you do not agree with. Right. This is right. This is not a new notion, right? It's literally Federalist Paper number 2. In a democracy, you will have factions, and you need a container for disagreement. And we have to have the capacity for generative conflict, which I would argue we are just failing spectacularly at right now. And I worry about that from both ends of the political spectrum, right? Aside from my personal convictions and beliefs, I worry about like that commitment to schooling that preserves and promotes and just cherishes the practice of democracy right now. So that is weighing very heavily on my mind in this moment.
In one of our conversations, you definitely said the idea of inquiry as learning was radical, right, in the 1960s when Dewey introduced it. And the idea of it really challenging the status quo and rote learning. And I think we have to kind of think about the role of inquiry-based learning, the role of developing young people's ability to question, to think about what matters in their community, in their world, and to think about when to act. So I'm kind of, reiterating, doubling down on that. The other thing, when I was talking about COVID a moment ago, one of my colleagues and dear friends, who's the dean of the School of Education at the University of San Francisco, where I used to be, she talked about the importance of developing young people who could read realities, imagine different possibilities in the future, and kind of bring a more just world into being. And so I think that's also a mission we ought to revisit in public education. Whatever.
Well, thanks. I actually have a kind of an expansion on what you just addressed. I'm really reflecting on this notion of like coalition building and responding to systems. And in secondary schools and all schooling, you talk about how we created the system in response to our economic needs, to this institutional cultural demand. And I'm really curious, if we want to create change in secondary school, what systems and institutions do you think we should be engaging with and responding to create purposeful change in secondary education that can lead to success or thriving in today, unlike in the 1800s?
Yeah. I think that's right. We have to remember that the industrial model schooling was designed in an efficiency model, and that is what that keeps schools as they are, right? And every time we present a model that's different, we're kind of fighting against that pull. And so I think we both need to dislodge like the policies that kind of keep us in lockstep with that model. And as well as what you're naming, kind of think of school as an ecosystem that's much larger. So whether that's libraries or hospitals or other kinds of industry partners, I think there are ways in which those partnerships can kind of blur the walls of school and where learning happens. And I think that's a really important way to expand what it can look like.
Yeah, I would just pick up on the question about like which types of organizations should we be interacting with. I would start with not who we shouldn't be interacting with, but like we talk to these people enough. Can we do more? So one, in general terms, yes, absolutely every school needs to spend more time out in its community, At least that's my general observation as in the field. I do want to caution us because in my organization is a great example of this, right? We came out of a conversation about career readiness. So the primary paradigm when schools in our network think about leaving their school building is to think about engaging with business and industry. That just reifies the commitment to economic ends, which I'm not saying isn't, but it's very incomplete. So I think we need to broaden dramatically the types of organizations that we think about collaborating with when we leave the school building. So last week I was in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. I saw this really thoughtful and compelling project of a new museum being built. And so this elementary school class had this deep collaboration with the designers and builders of the Thaddeus Stevens Museum in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. So whether those are nonprofits, whether those are civic organizations, I think obviously again the career readiness piece is important, but I don't want us to center business every time we walk out of the school building.
It's great to listen to you all share with us. I'm thinking about the deeper learning research, especially Dr. Sarah Fine, Dr. John Mehta, and also some of the scale work that we're doing in San Francisco and Asheville at the district level. And so whether it's like the In Search of Deeper Learning research or the Deeper Learning Dozen, just curious how that is manifesting in your work, LPI's work, or any of the spaces.
Yeah. Yeah, they've written with us and recently have a publication in April 10th. They'll be in a webinar around preparing educators and preparing pre-service educators and kind of professional development in practice. So yeah, very much kind of on our minds, thinking about the ways in which we continue. I think one of the questions is like, how do we make sure educators are ready for these redesigned schools, right? And what is the work that we need to do? Because there are ways in which people can be prepared and then they're in a context and it can't happen. I mean, I think when I was kind of doing work as a preparing master's students, I often was thinking about the ways in which we need to prepare teachers for the schools we want, not what are. And so I think that's the kind of bind we're constantly in, and it's hard to kind of think parallelly, but I think that's kind of required. I don't know that there's another. So I only half answered your question. Jim might have a better response.
I'm sure I don't have a better answer. Certainly we pay attention to the writing of all those organizations. And again, I think, for us, so much of our work is figuring out in community, like how can this change travel in this particular context? And so often when I'm reading work from Dr. Fine or Dr. Mehta or the Deeper Learning Dozen, that's the lens I'm taking, which is like, what are they learning? Like, what are the paths that change is traveling in the settings that they're talking about? I do think there's a really powerful principle, might be a slight overstatement, but like a principle of like, you have to match the unit of change with the path, right? So, for example, districts often treat individual educators as the unit of change, right? We do a system-wide training on project-based learning. But then we go back to school communities that aren't particularly organized or wired around that idea, right? So if you are going to approach individual educators as the unit of change or impact, well, then they need a source of like community and belonging that starts to nurture a piece of their identity as being connected to that practice. And if that's not going to happen in their school community, then it's got to happen somewhere else. If you're going to take on a whole school as the unit of change or impact, which is much of our historical work as an organization, then almost immediately it starts to press on the policies and systems and structures inside that school. So that's the change work you have to be prepared to take on. So I do think there is this really important principle that I'm thinking about when I read work like that of like, how do you match the unit of impact with the necessary like change supports needed to create a path for that to travel?
I have a question connected to learning policy. And I think it's like, what is it? How does it happen? What is the lifetime of learning policy? And maybe you could answer more with a story of policy you've been involved in and the transformation as a result. so we can like kind of understand in the details.
So the Learning Policy Institute, I think one of the core frames of research is really the science of learning and development. And so what are the ways that learners come to understand? What are the conditions they need? What are the things that educators need to be thoughtful about? But in terms of a policy, I would say one of the real policy agenda strategies was around community schooling. And so we have a group of other organizations that have designed the 4 pillars, and then California has had these huge investments in community schools. So the idea is what is happening in those spaces, and we've just kind of done a quantitative study about impact for students who are in community schools. Again, it's harder at the secondary level, and so that's kind of one of the impetus for kind of doing the work of this new Center for School and System Design. So it's kind of like what it needs to be in place. What does that look like at implementation? How do we think about improving, right, implementation, and what are the kinds of resources and capacities that need to be surrounded in order for that policy around community schools in particular to take shape? And really the research about like how it needs to be staffed, what do the relationships look like, and kind of how to do some asset mapping and all of those parts of it. So that's a specific policy. I don't know if that gets at what you had in mind. Yeah.
All right. I want to build on something that Jim said about generative conflict, because I think we often think of that in terms of like talking to people who disagree with us. But I also think it's about acknowledging our disagreements with our friends. And so you can completely ignore this if you want to, but I am curious to know, you all clearly have talked a lot. Is there generative conflict between the two of you? Is there something that you know that you disagree about that you'd be willing to share with us or have a different perspective on?
Or comment.
Here, I don't know that this is something we disagree about. We did talk a little bit about this, but I'll flag it as something that I think there's a lot of disagreement about in the space right now by people that have common values, but very different convictions about how to pursue those values, which is just the really hostile environment we're in around race and DEI and all of that. And in many many organizations right now, and my organization is a good example of this. Right, we're weighing how do we continue to articulate our values in a way that get us into conversations that we want to be in about equity and teaching and learning and race and identity. But how do we do that without putting network schools that we support around the country at risk? Right? And I think there's a really challenging conversation in this moment around like pragmatism about language, right? And there are people who believe strongly, like, no, if you're not using that language, you're not doing this work. And there are others that are thinking, no, we can soften that language and keep doing the work, and that's the work. And that is a conflict I am in and out of a lot personally, and I hear a lot right now. And I don't know how generative we're being in that space yet, but I think that's a very real conflict right now. I would love to know if you have a thought about that particular issue.
Yeah, and I mean, I would say it is complicated, right? I think it's really important to just make sure that we're continuing to do work that centers equity, right? That allows everybody's voice to be at the table, and that kind of allows us to do the best in developing young people and engaging them. And so, yeah, I do think a lot of times that means shifting language. It's odd that, sometimes it's just saying equity versus saying DEI. That's strange that should matter. But if it allows us to do the work, I'm happy to make that adjustment. But I do also think it is about protecting people. I think that's where the key issue is, because people are extraordinarily vulnerable. Lots of people are. And so that's where it matters to me in terms of how we advance our goals and protect people's safety and personhood, and continue to be focused and aligned on our mission. But there are a lot of examples in this moment of people making decisions that are financially based that aren't protective of the work. And that's, I think, what we have to really start to reckon with, in higher ed and other spaces. We have to really think hard about that. I get that we have to sustain institutions, but that's different than protecting people.
You've talked a lot about like systems thinking, systems change, systems improvement. What authors, frameworks, both inside and outside of education, do you rely on to help understand like systems thinking and complex systems change?
I have been really taken for a while with the literature on adult development, and specifically in the way it talks about attending to the development of our capacity for complexity, which I think is really bound up with systems thinking, right? And so the work of Jennifer Garvey Berger, for example, and her work around just like adult development, and I think her most recent book is literally called Complexity Fitness. And so I think that's a really like essential like individual capacity for us to develop. That, you know, the ability for us to hold like two perspectives that don't align and work towards making sense of them. The ability to think about a number of different variables that are at work in a given system. This is one of the things, at least for me personally, that I think about deeply in the practice of deeper learning, that like when we're doing that well, like we are developing people's capacity for complexity, like to manage really complex environments and scenarios, not only at the student level, but I also think at the adult level, like when, and sometimes that's a little more implicit, but equally as valuable. So that's not a systems thinker or organizational theory text, but that's where my mind goes.
Yeah, I don't have a lot at the tip of my tongue at the moment. I'm having an interesting writing with someone who comes out of policy health, and she and I are talking about what does system change look like in education versus public policy in health particular. And so that's been interesting to kind of name the different frames that inform that work and to kind of find threads in common, particularly as we think about ecosystems and think about the commonalities in the systems change there that we need to engage. So that's forthcoming, and it'll be fun to share out.
Hi, thinking through this idea of protecting people and protecting our students by continuing to teach truth, continuing to teach real history, but also protecting our teachers. And I'm wondering, in a licensure program, teaching new teachers about the environment that they're walking into now, which is dangerous. Aside from teaching the legacy and history of Black literary societies and Woodson's legacy and subversive teaching, what's the practical advice that you would give teachers entering this environment that we have today?
Sure, I'll start. I was a while ago, and it kind of connected to this idea of like preparing for the schools we hope. And I was out of a teacher ed program at Penn that was urban focused, but also students may or may not have stayed in those environments. But really, it was about negotiating, right? Like with how you're trained to teach, what your commitments are in terms of your stance as a teacher, and then how to manage those policies when you get into the school setting. So that's one kind of thought I have about preparing, right? Because we don't know what it will look like tomorrow versus next year. But the other thing I would say is that some of this, the ideas about, you know, what diversity is doing, or, you know, even kind of what is anti fill in the blank, I mean, that's not real, right? In terms of preparing students to understand Black history, how can that be a problem, right? And so I think there is a way to really help people discern kind of what is at issue and what is a real danger and what is the work that we need to just continue to take up, right? So some of that is just to threaten, but it doesn't have any reality in terms of it being indoctrinating. I think that's the word we should use, right? Because that's what the EO says, right? That we cannot engage in indoctrination in schools. So like, let's just challenge that. Let's just say what we are doing, and what what is not indoctrination.
I might just add to that that I think picks up on Cheryl's notion of like people protecting one another, but also themselves. Just a small comment about pragmatism. Early in my career, when I was part of opening a charter school, there was a lawsuit filed literally the day we opened the school. And for a long time, I really thought if we could just get in the room together and have a conversation, like we could sort this out. I'm not that arrogant anymore. I won't go so far as to say I'm not arrogant, but I'm not that arrogant anymore. So I do think, to Cheryl's point, like there are times when there's conflict because there's misunderstanding, there are questions, we're responding to things we hear in the media, and there is an opportunity for real dialogue. And then there are times when there is just outright hostility. And if your assessment or sense making is that that is what you're confronting, then I think it's okay to protect yourself, whatever that means in that context. And when there is a genuine opportunity for dialogue and sense making and reconciliation across multiple viewpoints, lean in.
Thank you both. And so now these are your final words. Well, not forever, just for this din. You each have about 90 seconds. What do you want to leave the folks with?
Well, I just appreciate just being here, the opportunity to talk with Jim, but to talk with all of you, and just like continuing to find space and communities that kind of support you in the work, and to think about what are the opportunities for building on that momentum. I think the other thing is that we're in a mode, many of us, of just like kind of reacting and trying to make sense in an impossible kind of fast-paced, changing environment. And what I've been saying to kind of family and friends and peers is like, continue to find space to dream beyond this moment, right? We just have to be in a space of possibility and potential and hope. And if we spend, a lot of time in fear and in confusion, we miss opportunity, and let's not let that happen.
I would just really underline something that Cheryl said earlier to start, which is, in moments of disruption, in moments of transition, in moments of decline for institutions, for all of that turbulence, right, there is a receptivity to our agency that gets expanded, right? Systems actually become more susceptible to change in such moments. So again, I'm just underlining the point Cheryl's already made about like there's an opportunity in this moment. I get that it's hard to feel that way in moments, but to really that there is possibility for us in this moment, and there is a receptivity to our agency in this moment that is there. And then the other thing I would say, which I think connects very much to Cheryl's point about like just dreaming beyond the future. I think one of the great things about this week, this conference, the deeper learning community in general, right, is there's this broad collection of big ideas that one of the things they can offer you, whether you're a school leader or a classroom educator or a district leader, is this really like powerful vision about what that future could look like, right? Like you have to cling to that and be just like relentlessly fanatical about that vision and endlessly flexible about what it might look like to get there and keeping progress. And you've got to hold those two things at the same time, which is like never let go of that picture, literally to the point of maybe even being a little rigid, but endlessly flexible about the million different paths you could walk to make progress towards that vision.
Let's give them a warm round of applause. Thank you, Dr. Cheryl. Thank you, Jim. And I'm so glad that you said economics is not important, because our gratitude is this T-shirt and a thank you card. So here you go. Thank you so much for sharing with our community. And thank you all for joining this din. You all now, it's 11 o'clock. Our closing ceremonies and keynote and all of that starts at 11:45. So you have some spacious time to just connect, maybe go do some makerspace things, hang out, ask them more questions. But thank you so much for coming, and we'll see. Y'all are all going to be there, right? You do not want to miss this closing. All right, thank you so much. Thank you. And thank you, Austin and Sound Image, for all that.